Hi everyone, I'm Eli, and one of the things that we like to do in Nazareth is tell stories. And so, do you enjoy stories? Do you like stories?
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the story of the Passover? How many of you are familiar with that story? It's one of our favorites in Nazareth and in Galilee, and we tell it every year. And it's important because we don't have these things that you have called books and screens, and we don't have the Roman theaters. And so we have to just speak our stories. We tell our stories to our children and to our people. And the Passover is one of them. So I need your help telling it. Will you help me? So a long time ago, our people were slaves in Egypt. Now, who thinks they know what a slave means? What does it mean to be a slave? Yes, and how do you think we felt being slaves to a different group of people? Yeah, and so we started to cry out to God. That's all we could do, but that's really the best thing that we could do. We prayed and we cried out to God for deliverance and for salvation from the Egyptians and from Egypt and from our slavery. And God heard our cries. God heard us. And after a time of living in slavery, God sent one of our greatest prophets. We consider him one of our greatest leaders and prophets. Does anyone think they know who that person was? Yes, Moses. Moses and his brother Aaron, God sent them to send a message to Pharaoh to let our people go. So this is the first part where I need your help. So when I say, Pharaoh, let my people, I want you to yell go as loud as you can at the top of your lungs. And then I'll say, but Pharaoh said, and I want you to yell no as loud as you can at the top of your lungs. And so Moses and Aaron, they went to Pharaoh and they said, Pharaoh, God says, let my people go. But Pharaoh said,
No.
Yes, Pharaoh said no. Why do you think that Pharaoh said no? Yes, and so God told Pharaoh that he was going to start to send plagues. Now, who thinks they know what a plague is? What would you call a plague? Yeah, these horrible things, these catastrophes, these events. God decided that he was going to send plagues to punish Egypt and to fight against the gods of Egypt. And so, does anyone know what the first plague was? What was the first plague that God sent on Egypt? Yes, and so God turned all of the water in the Nile into human blood. And that wasn't just in the Nile. They used that water to drink and to wash their clothes and to grow their crops. They used their water for all sorts of things. So what would you do if you turned on the faucet or you turned on the shower? You had to wash your clothes or wash your body and it was human blood. Ew, make those faces. What would you say? What sound would you make? Yes, so do this with me. We're going to do a physical movement for all of the 10 plagues. So this is like we're wading out into the water. We're wading out into the Nile River, but it's all filled with blood. And so after the Nile was turned into blood, God sent Moses and Aaron back to Pharaoh. And they said, Pharaoh, God says, let my people
Go!
go! But Pharaoh said,
No.
no! He said no again. And so God sent a second plague on Egypt. And here, do this with me like a hopping frog. What sounds do frogs make? God sent frogs all over the land of Egypt. There were frogs inside of the houses and all over the people and the animals and outdoors. There were frogs all across the land of Egypt. These hopping frogs. Do this with me like a hopping frog hopping in your hand. And so first God sent the blood over the Nile, and then he sent the frogs all over the land of Egypt. And still Pharaoh said no. And so Moses and Aaron, they came back to the palace. They came back to Pharaoh. And they said, Pharaoh, God says, let my people
Go!
But Pharaoh said,
No.
Again, Pharaoh said no. And so God sent a third plague. God sent gnats, flies. They're like tiny little flies that are itchy and they swarm all around you, around your neck and your face. Do this with me. Oh, there's gnats all over the land of Egypt. Moses slapped the dirt and the dust with his staff, and gnats went all over the land of Egypt, all over the people's faces and their eyes and their ears and their nose. There were gnats everywhere. And still, Pharaoh wouldn't let the people go. And so God sent a fourth plague, and this time the gnats were bigger. This time, God sent flies. Do this with me, like you're shooing away the flies, you're swatting away the flies. The fourth plague was a plague of flies all over the land of Egypt. There were flies everywhere, on the people, on the animals. Imagine if you were walking outside to school, or as you're going to work, or when you're inside your house at the end of the day, and there's big black flies everywhere, biting you, buzzing around you. That was the fourth plague. But still, Pharaoh said,
No.
no. Why do you think Pharaoh kept saying no? Why did Pharaoh still not let the people go? I mean, he was risking his people and his animals and the health and the safety and eventually the food. All of this because he wouldn't let go of control. He was prideful and his heart was hard towards God, and he wanted his way, even when everything was falling apart. And so, after the blood, do this with me, after the blood in the Nile and the frogs around Egypt and the gnats that were flying around all the people's faces and the flies, God sent a fifth plague. Does anyone think they know what the fifth plague is? What was the fifth plague that God sent on Egypt? With this plague, all of the big beasts of burden, the big animals that are outdoors. Have you ever been to a farm before? Or seen those work animals, these livestock? They got sick. Do this with me, like you're laying in bed and you're sick. They got sick and then they died. Sad. They got sick and they died. That was the fifth plague. That was their food. That was their sacrifice. That helped them to do all the heavy lifting and the hard work besides us, the Israelites. And still, Moses and Aaron, they marched into Pharaoh's palace and they said, Pharaoh, God says, let my people go. But Pharaoh said,
No.
Pharaoh said no. 5 plagues. 5 plagues on the land of Egypt. And so the 6th plague started to affect the people more now. There were boils. Does anyone know what a boil is? What's a boil? It's kind of like a large bump or sore on your body. Rub your arms like there's boils all over your body. So now the Egyptians had big boils growing on their body, and they're painful and they're sore and they hurt. Imagine if you couldn't walk, you couldn't move. Boils from head to toe. And so Moses and Aaron, they went back to Pharaoh after the 6th plague, and they said, Pharaoh, God says, let my people
Go.
But Pharaoh said,
No.
Pharaoh said no. After 6 plagues, Pharaoh still said no. So now, God sent a storm. Now, we're going to make the storm together. So, sit down with me, and I want you to start rubbing your palms together. So, this is the beginning of the storm. This is the breeze and the wind. And now start snapping your fingers together. Now the rain is starting to fall. The rain started to fall across the land of Egypt. Now start to slap your thighs. Now the rain started to pick up. Now go faster and harder. There was a large storm, and there was lightning in the sky, and there was thunder, and there was rain coming down, and large hailstones. Those are like big balls of ice, and they can hurt. They can even kill people and animals. And these large pieces of hail were coming down, and God had warned the Egyptians to get the servants and the animals indoors to protect them. But the people that didn't believe God, they left the servants and the animals in the fields, and they died. And so now there was destruction all across the land of Egypt. Their food and their water and their livestock and their animals and their people. Do you think Pharaoh let the people go?
No.
He still didn't let the people go. After all that, Pharaoh still did not let the people go. And so now God sent a 7th plague, and that was the locust. Have you seen locust? Imagine kind of like a flying grasshopper type of thing or dragonfly, and they can eat up the crops. Do this with me, like you're eating up all the crops. It was eating the rest of their food and their sacrifices and the things they had to eat and to survive on, eating all the crops. And so Moses and Aaron, they went back to the palace. They went back to see Pharaoh, and they said, Pharaoh, God says, let my people
Go.
But Pharaoh said,
No.
Again, Pharaoh said no. And so now there'd be 2 more plagues, and these were more closely tied together. Do you know what the 9th plague was? The second to last plague that God sent on Egypt. Close your eyes with me, and then put your hands over your face. Now open your eyes. That's how dark it was with their eyes open. You couldn't even see a hand in front of your face. They said it was a darkness that could be felt. There was darkness all around the land of Egypt. They couldn't even go outside. They couldn't even go to work because there was pitch darkness. They had to sit in their house all day. Imagine sitting in a dark house for hours and hours and hours. And God said that he would send 1 more plague. And after this plague, Pharaoh would finally let the people go. And so before the plague happened, he told our people to do something. Does anyone know what he told us to do? We had to take an animal and slaughter it. What was the animal? A lamb. You can say a lamb or a sheep. We had to kill the sheep. And it had to be a special type of sheep. Does anyone know what type of sheep? Yes, it had to be a firstborn. It had to be a boy. It had to be a male. It had to be spotless. It had to be pure. And we were to take it, and then we were to take the blood. And then we had to dip a hyssop branch, a certain type of branch in Israel. We had to dip it in the blood of the lamb. And that's actually the branch that the priests use at the temple to purify from sin. And David talks about it in the Psalms when he says, cleanse me with hyssop and I shall be clean. And here, do this with me. We're going to dip the hyssop branch into the blood and then spread it over the door frame. That's the left and the right side of the door, and the door post, the top. So we're going to spread the blood over the door frame and across the doorpost and down the other side. And God said if we did that, then our firstborn animals and children would be safe. But for the people that didn't do it, there would be a destroyer or a destroying angel that would pass over Egypt that night. That's why we call it Passover, that it would pass over the homes without touching our children and animals. But for the people and a lot of the Egyptians, their firstborn children and animals would die. And so that night, we were all huddled together. Get really close, huddled together. We were huddled together inside of our homes with the blood on the door. And we waited and waited and waited. And when morning came, the people that had the blood on the doors still had their children and their animals. But all throughout the land of Egypt, for the Egyptians, they actually say that there was not one house without a dead person in it. All of the Egyptians lost at least one person in their family and in their house, including Pharaoh. Pharaoh's firstborn son, his heir, died. God put him to death. And after that, Pharaoh finally let the people go. And even though he tried to stop us again at the sea, God told Moses to hold up his staff, and he parted the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds, and we walked through the middle on dry ground. And so every year we tell the Passover story to remember who God is and what God's done for us and how he brought us out of the iron furnace, out of slavery and bondage, and he saved us and he delivered us and made us his people. And so we share that with our children and with our children's children every year. Do you have anything that you do where you're from that's similar? What about, do you have any holidays or festivals where you celebrate your freedom when you finally got your freedom? Yes. And so every year you can remember that and be thankful for what he's done. And maybe as you read the Passover, you'll be able to see and relate to it in your own life. And so, my friends, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the children's area and welcome to the Museum of the Bible.